energy boondoggles around the world finally blowing up, and it's delicious. In the UK, a total of 0 offshore wind projects won contracts this year because nobody showed up to bid an auction for the government subsidies. Developers saying that the government wasn't offering enough to offset rising costs.
And Biden has plowed ahead with his offshore wind auction in the Gulf of Mexico, and construction has already started in Nantucket. Despite the UK's lack of success, it's full steam ahead into the wind. Join us now, Substack author Michael Shellenberger. Michael, good to see you. So what do you make of the distinction? The UK, they can't find bidders. They're not going forward with wind projects. But here in the United States, Joe Biden is dumping a ton of cash and building windmills.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. I mean, you have to remember that taxpayers subsidize at least 1/3 of the cost of the electricity from these wind turbines, and they're still too expensive to build. You know, we've been drawing attention to the fact that we now have very strong data showing that the wind industry is behind the increased deaths of whales, dolphins, and other cetaceans. We have very strong evidence that the sonar, as well as the increased boat traffic, is causing it. But we also know now that the wind energy, what the cost is expected to be, is 3 times more expensive than the cost of the electricity from the nuclear power plants that would have provided more power than all the wind turbines they're going to build.
It is so deeply dishonest, Michael, even overseas, with the failure of this offshore wind auction in Great Britain. And Rishi Sunak is waking up to the fact that the world is still using fossil fuels. It's cheap and plentiful. But when they write about what happened, they're like, oh, the UK is going to miss the climate goals. This is an energy security disaster. They write in Britain about how costs will go up because the wind turbines and the wind farms offshore won't be built. And you have written about this. That is absolutely the exact opposite. That these wind turbines produce electricity and result in higher costs and as you said, kill sea life.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I think the thing you have to keep in mind, if they cared about climate change, they wouldn't have closed all of those nuclear plants, which would have obviated the need for all these additional wind turbines. And so we see that 3 times higher price for the electricity from the wind than from the nuclear. And keep in mind that you always have to have fossil fuel, usually in the form of natural gas, to back up the electricity from those wind turbines when the wind stops blowing, which is somewhere between 60 to 70% of the time. So it's a terrible investment for ratepayers, terrible investment for consumers. It's unreliable electricity. I mean, what people actually call it that work in the industry, they call it garbage energy, because it's not producing it in that reliable way that we have that we need to have electricity produced for us. Plus, it requires all this additional backup transmission and the huge impacts on wildlife because it's so energy dilute. So I do think that at the end of the day, these projects aren't going to happen, both because it just requires environmental impacts that are too big and because the economic cost is just too high.
And Michael, you do a nice job of laying out the economic cost, how inefficient these windmills are. But if you look back at liberal policies, and I think you're a great explainer of liberal ideology, they used to care about the environment. And when I think of liberal, I think of Save the Whales. And it seems like all these liberals have abandoned the environment that they used to wrap their hands around, that they wanted to protect and save and cherish. Now they have policies that they completely disregard what they used to stand for.
Yeah, I mean, renewables are an ideological energy. They're inefficient, they're unreliable, they're expensive. People think it harmonizes you with the natural environment, but the reality is because wind and sunlight are so dilute, you have to put machines all over the natural environment. We're looking at the potential extinction of the North Atlantic right whale by these wind turbines. This is not a small issue. This is the biggest environmental scandal in the world right now, by far. The fact that a so-called environmental technology might make an entire species of whale extinct. I mean, this is a fundamental moral issue. We just decided 60 years ago with the Endangered Species Act that we wouldn't ever allow that to happen. And the only reason it's getting to pass is because people have been brainwashed into thinking that wind energy is somehow good for the natural environment when it's obviously not.
Yeah, here we are.
And, you know, this new Vineyard wind turbine farm that's off the coast of Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket, you know, Nantucket got $16 million in restitution from an organization, from the organizations behind that offshore wind farm, Michael, and they signed an agreement binding the town to not criticize the project. So they got a bribe, got paid off. I wonder what will happen when the whales, the dead whales, start washing up on Nantucket and the Vineyard.
It's already starting to happen. We've had 71 dead whales recorded since December 1st last year. Another one died on Tuesday. They nicknamed her Faith, the people that found her. She was floating right next to the base of a wind turbine that they're in the process of building. You couldn't have had more direct evidence that the wind industry is killing whales than that example there. It's a very sad, tragic situation, but it should also make us angry, and really should make Orsted and Governor Murphy and all the governors up along the East Coast put an end to this debacle before we really see the extinction occur.
Michael Shellenberger, thank you for joining us. And by the way, great reporting. Thanks for keeping all of us informed. We appreciate it. Great stuff.
Thanks for having me.